The sterile white walls that once echoed with the sounds of healing now stand silent and forgotten. Old medical facilities carry with them decades of pain, suffering, and death. Tonight, I'm sharing 5 true horror stories from people who experienced something truly terrifying in these abandoned places of medicine. These are their stories. Story 1. The Night Shift Nurse. Sarah had been working as a nurse for over 15 years when she took a job at Riverside General Hospital. The building was old, built in the 1940s, and scheduled for demolition within the year. Most of the hospital had already been shut down, but the emergency wing remained open to serve the small rural community. Working the night shift meant Sarah was often alone on her floor. The skeleton crew included just 2 other nurses, a security guard, and whoever was on duty in the emergency room downstairs. The upper floors had been closed for months, their rooms empty and dark. It was around 2 a.m. on a Tuesday when Sarah first heard the elevator moving. She looked up from her paperwork at the nurses' station and watched the old brass indicator above the elevator doors. The numbers lit up 1 by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The elevator stopped at the 5th floor. This was strange because the 5th floor had been sealed off for renovations that never happened. Sarah called down to security. "Hey Mike, did you send someone up to 5? "Negative. Nobody's been up there in weeks. Probably just the old elevator acting up again." Sarah shrugged it off and went back to her charts. But 20 minutes later, she heard it again. The elevator descending. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Then silence. Over the next few nights, the pattern continued. Always around 2 a.m., the elevator would go up to the 5th floor, stay there for about 20 minutes, then come back down. Sarah mentioned it to the day shift supervisor, who just laughed. "That old elevator's been glitchy for years. Don't let it get to you." But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. On Thursday night, she decided to investigate. When the elevator started its journey upward, she quickly grabbed a flashlight and headed for the stairwell. The 5th floor was pitch black. Emergency lighting cast eerie red shadows down the hallway. Sarah's footsteps echoed on the linoleum as she made her way toward the elevator. The doors were closed, but she could hear something inside. It sounded like crying. Soft, muffled sobs coming from within the elevator car. Sarah pressed the call button. The doors opened with a mechanical groan, revealing nothing. The elevator was completely empty, but the crying continued, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. She stepped back, her heart racing. That's when she noticed the patient chart lying on the elevator floor. Sarah picked it up with trembling hands and read the name, Margaret Chen, room 512. Admitted October 15, 1987. Cause of death, complications during surgery. Sarah ran back to the stairwell and didn't stop until she reached her floor. She looked up Margaret Chen in the hospital's old records. Sure enough, Margaret had died on the 5th floor 35 years ago. She had been wheeled down to surgery on the ground floor, but complications arose, and she passed away in the elevator while being rushed back upstairs. The next night, Sarah requested a transfer to the day shift. She never worked another night in that hospital. 6 months later, when the building was finally demolished, workers found Margaret Chen's medical bracelet wedged in the elevator shaft between the 4th and 5th floors. Story 2. The Pediatric Ward. Dr. James Mitchell thought he was getting a great deal when he rented office space in the old St. Mary's Medical Center. The building had been a children's hospital for over 60 years before closing in 2018. Now, the bottom 2 floors were being converted into private medical offices. James, a pediatric psychologist, found it fitting to set up his practice in what used to be the pediatric ward. The rent was cheap, and he could help the local community while building his practice. His office was in what used to be room 204, a former patient room that he had converted into a comfortable space for therapy sessions. The walls were painted in cheerful colors, and he had filled the room with toys and books to help children feel at ease. Everything was normal for the first few weeks. James saw his regular patients, mostly kids dealing with anxiety or behavioral issues. But then strange things started happening during his sessions. It began with 8-year-old Tommy Martinez. Tommy was usually very talkative during their sessions, but on this particular Tuesday, he became quiet and kept staring at the corner of the room. "Tommy, what are you looking at?" James asked. "The girl over there. She looks sad." James turned to look. The corner was empty except for a small bookshelf. "What girl, Tommy?" "I don't see anyone." "The one in the hospital gown. She's been there the whole time. Don't you see her?" A chill ran down James's spine, but he tried to remain professional. Sometimes our imagination can make us see things that aren't there. "It's okay." But Tommy shook his head. "She's real. She wants to know why no one visits her anymore." Over the next few weeks, 3 more children mentioned seeing a girl in a hospital gown. They all describe her the same way. About 10 years old, pale, with long dark hair, standing in various corners of the room. The children seemed genuinely frightened, and some refused to continue their sessions. James decided to research the history of room 204. He contacted the hospital's former administrator, Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, who was now in her 70s but had a sharp memory. "Room 204, she said over the phone. "Oh yes, that was little Emma Rodriguez's room. Such a sweet child. She was there for nearly 2 years. What was wrong with her?" There was a long pause. "Leukemia. She fought so hard, but, well, you know how these things go." The worst part was that her parents stopped visiting after the first year. "I think it was too painful for them. Emma used to ask every day when they were coming back." "When did she pass away?" "November 2016. She died alone, poor thing. The night nurse found her in the morning. She had been asking for her parents right up until the end." That night, James stayed late to review his notes. Around 9 p.m., as he was packing up to leave, he heard something that made his blood freeze. It was the sound of a child crying, coming from somewhere in the office. He followed the sound to a supply closet he rarely used. When he opened the door, the crying stopped immediately. Inside, written on the wall in what looked like crayon, were the words, "When are Mommy and Daddy coming?" James never saw who wrote it. The writing hadn't been there when he first moved in. He was sure of that. He decided to do some research on Emma Rodriguez. Through public records, he found her parents' address. They still lived in the same house, about 20 minutes away. James wrestled with whether he should contact them, but something told him Emma needed closure. When he called, Emma's mother, Maria, broke down crying. She explained how guilt had consumed her and her husband. They had been unable to face their dying daughter, and the shame had destroyed their marriage and their lives. "We loved her so much," Maria sobbed. "But seeing her suffer, we were cowards. We've regretted it every day since." James convinced Maria and her ex-husband to come to the office for a session. Not as patients, but to help them find peace. When they arrived, James guided them to room 204 and encouraged them to speak to Emma as if she were there. "I'm sorry, Mija," Maria whispered to the empty room. "We should have been here. We should have been brave for you." Her ex-husband, Roberto, was crying now too. "We love you, Emma. We always loved you." As they spoke, the temperature in the room seemed to drop, and James could swear he felt a presence. Then, just as suddenly, a sense of peace filled the space. After that day, no child ever mentioned seeing the girl in the hospital gown again. Emma had finally heard what she needed to hear. Story 3. The Surgery Wing. Urban explorer Marcus Webb had been documenting abandoned buildings for his YouTube channel for over 3 years. When he heard about the old Metropolitan Surgery Center, he knew he had to investigate. The facility had been closed for 5 years after a series of malpractice lawsuits, and the building had been left to decay. Marcus arrived at the facility around midnight with his camera equipment and flashlights. The building was a sprawling complex with multiple wings, but he was most interested in the surgery floors. Those were the areas where the most disturbing stories had originated. The main entrance was boarded up, but Marcus found an unlocked service door on the side of the building. Inside, his flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing hallways lined with empty rooms. The air was stale and smelled of disinfectant mixed with something else, something rotting. Marcus made his way to the surgical wing on the 3rd floor. The operating theaters were still intact, their equipment covered in dust and shadows. It was perfect for his video. "What's up, explorers?" he whispered into his camera. "I'm here at the abandoned Metropolitan Surgery Center. This place has been closed since 2018 after some seriously messed up stuff happened here. Let's see what we can find. As Marcus moved through the first operating room, he noticed that some of the surgical instruments were still laid out on trays, as if the doctors had simply walked away mid-procedure. He filmed everything, narrating in his usual style. But then he heard something that made him stop recording. It was the sound of medical equipment beeping, coming from somewhere deeper in the wing. Marcus followed the sound down a corridor lined with recovery rooms. The beeping grew louder as he approached the last room on the left. The door was slightly ajar, and a faint green light was visible from inside. He pushed the door open and nearly dropped his camera. There, on a hospital bed in the center of the room, was a patient monitor. It was turned on, displaying a steady heartbeat rhythm, even though there was no patient connected to it. "What the hell?" Marcus whispered, filming the monitor. He looked around the room for a power source but couldn't find any active electrical connections. The rest of the building's power had been shut off years ago. As he approached the monitor, the heartbeat suddenly flatlined. The steady beep became one long, continuous tone. Then, just as abruptly, it went silent. The screen went black. Marcus was about to leave when he noticed something else. There were patient charts scattered on the floor near the bed. He picked one up and read it by flashlight. The name at the top was David Park, admitted for routine appendix surgery in March 2018. According to the chart, David had died during the operation due to anesthesia complications. But what disturbed Marcus most was the handwritten note at the bottom of the last page. Patient experienced awareness during procedure. Expressed terror but was unable to move or speak. Investigation pending. Marcus felt sick. He had heard about anesthesia awareness, patients being conscious during surgery but paralyzed and unable to communicate their distress. It was every patient's worst nightmare. He continued reading through the charts scattered around the room. There were 5 of them, all documenting similar cases of anesthesia awareness that had occurred at the facility. Each patient had died during or shortly after their operations. As Marcus was photographing the documents, he heard something that made his skin crawl. It was the sound of muffled screaming, as if someone was trying to cry out but couldn't move their mouth. The sound seemed to be coming from the operating room next door. He grabbed his camera and rushed toward the sound. The operating room was empty, but the screaming continued. It was coming from everywhere: the walls, the ceiling, the floor beneath his feet. Multiple voices, all crying out in terror and pain. Marcus ran. He didn't stop running until he was outside the building and in his car. When he reviewed his footage later, he discovered something chilling. On the patient monitor screen, just before it flatlined, you could make out a reflection in the dark screen. It showed the faces of 5 people lying on hospital beds, their eyes wide with terror, their mouths open in silent screams. Marcus never published that video. He deleted all the footage and never spoke publicly about what happened that night. 6 months later, the Metropolitan Surgery Center was demolished after city inspectors found structural hazards. But Marcus knew the real reason they tore it down. Some places hold on to the pain and terror of the past, and that building had absorbed too much of both to ever be at peace. Story 4. The Emergency Room. Dr. Patricia Williams had worked in emergency medicine for 22 years, but she had never experienced anything like her assignment at Mercy General Hospital. The hospital was in its final month of operation before closing permanently, and Patricia was part of the skeleton crew keeping the emergency room functional during the transition. The building was over 80 years old, and most of its departments had already been shut down and cleared out. Only the ER remained active, and even that was operating with minimal staff. Patricia often found herself working alone with just 1 nurse and a security guard for the entire night shift. It was during her 3rd week at Mercy General that Patricia first encountered something she couldn't explain medically. She was treating a homeless man who had been brought in with chest pains when she heard voices coming from the direction of the abandoned ICU wing. The voices sounded like medical staff calling out urgent instructions. "We need another unit of blood. Get me 20 milligrams of morphine." His pressures dropping. Patricia looked at her nurse, Janet, who had heard it too. "Is there another team working somewhere in the building?" "No, doctor. We're the only medical staff on duty tonight. That wing's been closed for 3 weeks." But the voices continued, growing more frantic. Patricia could hear what sounded like a full trauma team working on a critical patient. She decided to investigate. The ICU wing was dark and eerily quiet as Patricia and Janet made their way down the hallway. But as they got closer to the voices, they realized something disturbing. The sounds were coming from room 302, but when they reached the room, it was completely empty. The voices stopped the moment they opened the door. "That was weird," Janet whispered. "It sounded so real." Patricia was about to respond when she noticed something on the floor. There were fresh footprints in the dust, leading from the empty bed to the window. But the window was on the 3rd floor, and there was no fire escape. They returned to the ER, but the incident bothered Patricia for the rest of her shift. The next morning, she asked the day supervisor about room 302. "Oh, that room," he said with a grimace. "We had a bad case there about a month ago. A young construction worker, maybe 25 years old, fell from a scaffolding. Massive internal injuries. Dr. Richards and his team worked on him for hours, but they couldn't save him." "What was unusual about it?" "The kid kept asking for his fiancée, Sarah. Kept saying he had to tell her something important before he died. But she never showed up. Turns out she didn't even know he'd been injured. By the time someone tracked her down, he was gone." That night, Patricia hoped for a quiet shift. But around 3 a.m., the voices returned. This time, they were clearer, and Patricia could make out specific words. "Sarah. Need to tell Sarah." The voice was weak, desperate, and definitely coming from room 302. Patricia grabbed a flashlight and went to investigate alone. As she approached the room, she could hear medical equipment beeping and the sound of labored breathing. When she opened the door, the sound stopped immediately. But this time, Patricia noticed something that made her heart race. There was a message written in the condensation on the window. "Find Sarah Mitchell. Tell her I loved her. Tell her yes." Patricia took a photo of the message with her phone before it faded away. The next day, she spent her lunch break trying to track down Sarah Mitchell. After several phone calls, she found her working at a flower shop across town. When Patricia called and explained who she was, Sarah broke down crying. "Tommy Rodriguez," Sarah sobbed. "He was my fiancé. He died in that hospital 6 weeks ago, and I never got to say goodbye. I didn't even know he was there until it was too late. Sarah, I know this might sound strange, but I think Tommy is trying to communicate something to you. He keeps saying he needs to tell you something, and there was a message about telling you yes." There was silence on the phone for a long moment. Then Sarah began crying harder. The night before his accident, he was acting strange. Nervous. He kept starting to say something, then stopping. I think he was going to propose. I found a ring hidden in his apartment after the funeral." Patricia convinced Sarah to come to the hospital that night. She led her to room 302, though she wasn't sure what would happen. As they stood in the empty room, Patricia encouraged Sarah to speak to Tommy as if he were there. "Tommy, if you're here, I want you to know that I love you too," Sarah whispered. "And yes, Tommy. The answer is yes. I would have said yes." The room grew cold, and both women could feel a presence. Then, slowly, words began to appear in the condensation on the window. "Thank you. I can rest now." After that night, Patricia never heard the voices from room 302 again. Tommy had delivered his message and received his answer. Sometimes, love is strong enough to bridge the gap between life and death, even in the sterile halls of a hospital. Story 5. The Psychiatric Wing. Maintenance worker Carl Henderson had been cleaning office buildings for 30 years, but his contract at the old Riverside Psychiatric Hospital was unlike anything he had ever experienced. The hospital had closed 2 years earlier, and Carl's company had been hired to maintain the building while it sat empty, waiting for a buyer. The psychiatric wing was the most unsettling part of the facility. Long hallways lined with heavy doors, each leading to what used to be a patient room. Even though the building was empty, Carl couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched whenever he worked in that section. Carl always saved the psychiatric wing for last, hoping to get through it quickly and get out. But his job required thorough cleaning, and the building's owners were particular about maintaining the property. It was during his 4th week on the job that Carl first heard the piano. He was mopping the floor in the main hallway when he heard someone playing a beautiful, melancholy piece of music. The sound was coming from the recreation room at the end of the hall. Carl knew there was an old piano in that room. He had dusted it several times, but he also knew the building was supposed to be empty. He grabbed his radio and called his supervisor. "Hey Frank, you got anyone else working in the building tonight?" "Negative, Carl. You're the only one scheduled." "Why?" "Someone's playing the piano in the rec room." There was static on the radio for a moment. "Carl, that building's been locked down tight. Security cameras show only you going in. Must be your imagination." But Carl could still hear the music, clear as day. He decided to investigate. As he approached the recreation room, the melody became more distinct. It was a classical piece, played with skill and emotion. Carl pushed open the door to the rec room and froze. The piano bench was pulled out as if someone had been sitting there, and the keys were moving on their own, pressing down to create the haunting melody. But there was no one there. The playing stopped the moment Carl entered the room. He stood there for several minutes, his heart pounding, before backing out and closing the door behind him. The next night, Carl asked the building's former administrator, Mrs. Dorothy Klein, about the piano. She had worked at Riverside for over 40 years before it closed. "Oh, you must be hearing Eleanor," she said matter-of-factly. "Eleanor Vance was one of our long-term patients. She had severe depression but was incredibly gifted musically. She played that piano every day for 23 years. What happened to her?" Mrs. Klein's expression grew sad. "Eleanor never left the hospital. She died here in 2019, just a few months before we closed. The piano was her only connection to the outside world. She used to say that music was the only thing that made her feel alive." Over the next few weeks, Carl began to expect the piano music. It always started around 10 p.m. and lasted for about an hour. The melodies were always beautiful but tinged with an overwhelming sadness that made Carl's chest ache. One night, Carl decided to sit outside the rec room and listen. The music was more complex than usual, shifting between pieces that seemed to tell a story. As he listened, Carl began to understand that Eleanor was trying to communicate something. He pushed open the door and entered the room. The piano playing continued, and Carl could swear he saw the faint outline of a woman sitting at the bench. She was thin, with gray hair pulled back in a bun, wearing what looked like a hospital gown from decades past. "Eleanor," Carl said softly. "Is that you?" The playing stopped, but Carl felt a presence acknowledge him. Then, slowly, the piano began to play a different song, "Danny Boy," a tune Carl's grandmother used to sing to him when he was a child. Carl realized that Eleanor was lonely. She had spent decades in this building, and even in death, she couldn't leave. Music was her way of reaching out, of reminding the world that she had existed and that her life had meaning. From that night on, Carl made it a point to sit with Eleanor during her piano sessions. He would listen to her music and sometimes tell her about his day or share stories from his own life. It seemed to bring her comfort. One evening, Mrs. Klein visited the building to collect some forgotten files. Carl told her about his experiences with Eleanor, and she wasn't surprised. Eleanor always said she wanted to be remembered for her music, not for her illness, Mrs. Klein said. "Maybe you could help with that." Carl had an idea. He used his phone to record several of Eleanor's piano sessions and posted them on social media with the caption, "The ghost pianist of Riverside Hospital, Eleanor Vance's music lives on." The recordings went viral locally. People were moved by the beautiful, melancholy melodies and the story behind them. A local music teacher even transcribed some of the pieces and performed them at a community concert dedicated to Eleanor's memory. The last time Carl heard Eleanor play was the night after the concert. The music was different, lighter, more peaceful. At the end, she played a simple rendition of "Amazing Grace," and Carl knew it was her way of saying goodbye. The piano never played again after that night. Eleanor had found the recognition and remembrance she had been seeking. Sometimes, the spirits that linger in old places don't want to frighten us. They just want to be remembered for who they were when they were alive. These 5 stories remind us that old medical facilities hold more than just memories. They hold the echoes of every life that passed through their doors. Whether it's a nurse seeking closure, a child longing for her parents, patients desperate to be heard, a man with a final message of love, or a woman wanting to be remembered for her gifts rather than her illness, these spirits remind us that our humanity doesn't end when our bodies fail. Which story scared you the most? Comment below and subscribe for more true horror stories. And remember, the next time you pass an old hospital or medical facility, take a moment to think about all the lives that were touched within those walls. Some of them might still be there, waiting to tell their story.